Hey guys, it's ChairShot with you, and today we're going to have a very special guest, the man who needs no introduction, a legend in the sport, the franchise, Shane Douglas.
How you doing, my friend?
Shane,
Good to see you.
thanks for having us.
Your inaugural show tonight, correct?
Yeah, very first show.
Fantastic, exciting night.
Yes, very much excited about it. Shane's going to be with us, and we're just going to do a quick little interview. We call it 10 Questions with Shane Douglas. It's
Try to stump me.
Well, it's stuff that the fans have sent in, their own personal questions.
Sure.
There's something to pick your brain with, and we'll start off with the first thing, your thoughts on working in the UWF with Cowboy Bill Watts.
Well, looking back from today, back to then as a green kid, didn't know anything, didn't know what was up and what was down in wrestling. I was just excited to be along for the ride and watching some tremendous talent, the fabulous Freebirds, Hot Stuff Eddie Gilbert with Missy Hyatt, Dark Journey, The Missing Link, Terry Taylor. They just had a slew of tremendous talent that was down there. As a kid coming in, I knew that it was important to watch them.
Sure.
As a 33-year veteran today, looking back to the UWF, I've often called the UWF the ECW before ECW. Even though it wasn't as violent or as extreme as ECW was, it was hardcore, nose-to-nose, grinded out mat wrestling. That's what Bill Watts, the Cowboy, insisted on. And so it was great for me to get my break in the business there because I learned an awful lot there.
Right. A lot of people say that Bill was ahead of his time. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, yeah. Bill's an acquired taste. I respect him because I learned so much from him. But I was also intimidated of him and almost scared of him, because he was not a small dude, about 6'4", 6'3", 6'4", 280, 290, fingers like sausages. And as a kid just coming into the business and trying to just learn what's right and what's wrong, Bill's a very opposing character. But I also knew, because I had coaches like him prior to that in my athletic career, and I knew what Bill was trying to do. Bill was trying to be almost like a bully to bring the best out in us. Right. He wanted the best for us, so I got that from him and always liked working for Bill. And years later, in WCW and then WWF after that, when Bill was brought in as bookers at alternate times, Bill showed an awful lot of respect to me because he knew that I'd been broken into the business right.
Right. Right. And not too long after that, you moved on, of course, to the NWA.
Right. And
everybody remembers, I'm sure, the Dynamic Dudes.
Oh, yeah.
Thoughts on that team, and whose idea was that to put you guys together?
Well, it was Eddie Gilbert's idea to put us together, and the idea originally was conceived as Johnny and Shane, the next generation. They wanted something in that rock and roll express vein, something that was different, updated, but not a rip-off of the Rock and Roll Express. And they wanted two guys, Bobby Eaton was the workhorse, Stan Lane was the handsome guy, and I guess they were going with that same kind of paradigm. And we actually, a little trivia question, we actually debuted on the Music City Showdown where Funk got Flair to the power driver to the table.
Right.
We debuted that night working with Samoan SWAT team and Paul Heyman, of course, to become famous in my career.
Sure.
As Johnny and Shane, the next generation. And then the very next morning, Eddie Gilbert told us in the van to the hotel, going to the airport from the hotel, that Jim Hurd had come up with a tremendous idea, and that was to change our name to the Dynamic Dudes. And the reason for that was he claims he had commissioned a study on the West Coast, the theory being what starts on the West Coast moves east, and the two big words at that time, hey, that's dynamic, and hey dude, which is that's dynamic. So he thought, well, let's put the top two words together and came up with Dynamic Dudes. But this is also the guy that came up with the Ding-a-lings and,
yes.
and several other
great tag team there.
But my thoughts of being with Johnny, being his partner, was it was the first time I signed a contract that was worth real money, and up to that point I pretty much starved in the business. So I look back on it, there's some fun, I mean, there's some things that are embarrassing, especially look back now and see the haircut, the mullets, and the fluorescent tights and stuff, but I know what they were going through as a guy that's booked and a guy that's been an agent and a guy that's run companies. I know what they were going for, and with two young guys that could wrestle and could go. So it was fun, but those guys, like everybody has that picture in high school, they look back at it,
right.
Have that haircut.
Right. Well, that tag team, of course, but then maybe just a few years later, we all know the tag team of you and Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, winning the titles, the unified titles, I believe.
Right.
Thoughts on Steamboat and that tag team?
Wow. Steamboat ranks up there probably number one in the people that I've worked with in my career. And I've worked with some great ones, Hot Stuff, Eddie Gilbert, Terry Funk, slews of other big name stars, not to take anything away from any of them. But Ricky Steamboat was different in the vein that he was almost like an older brother. He took you under his wing. He was never criticizing. He'd never say, man, you really screwed up tonight, Shane. Even when I did screw up, he would say, Shane, tonight when you did that spot, what if you had done this first and then did that and then right after did this, and you could, in your mind's eye, roll through like a movie and go, man, that's brilliant. Right. He just had such a mind for the business, and I consider Steamboat then and now the greatest babyface I've ever walked in the business.
What about your program, of course, with the Hollywood Blondes?
Well, for me, Brian, and Steve, that was a tremendous learning experience because
Right.
we were all three following Ricky's lead. We were all three in about the same generation, about the same skill level. But Steamboat, of course, was a legend already at that point.
Sure.
So Steamboat took us out every night and made us go. I don't remember going less than 40, 45, 50 minutes, and often over 55 minutes because it had an hour time limit. But he knew, that was his time to showcase himself, but also his time to teach us by showcasing himself.
Right.
And we learned an awful lot from him.
Sure. Now, as we all know, Austin went on to be the mega star that he is today. Did
Sure.
you see the potential in Austin at that point?
Sure. Steve had such unbelievably natural athletic ability, but he also had that ability to sort of propel it outside of himself,
Right.
to be larger than life, even back then. And he's a big guy with those big, thick legs, and had the background in, I think, football. And it was a question as to whether or not he was going to translate over. But we used to get down and do some spots in there that today you'd have to sit down and explain it to somebody. But Steve, you'd call it right in the ring and go into it. So Steve showed the ambition all the way back then, and knew it was just a matter of time before it became something big.
Sure. From there, how was your approach to come in and work for ECW?
Well, it was a very different approach for me because I went into ECW as one of the few guys that had experience in the mainstream. Me and Funk were the only two really. And Sabu had been untested, although he'd been a fairly hot commodity in Japan. Taz had been untested, Dreamer, Sandman, all those guys had been untested. So, for me coming in, it was a huge paramount shift because I went from being a babyface to being a heel. And at the time, I think it's just the opposite of being a babyface. And it really wasn't. It was a lot more work to it than that. But I had Funk to learn from. So,
Sure.
Great fun memories.
And of course, everybody knows, the night goes down, you're probably already know what I'm getting ready to ask you. It's down in history, it's never going to change. Throwing the NWA World title down.
Sure.
What was your initial thoughts when you threw that title down on the mat?
Well, the week leading up to that, Paul Heyman had called me earlier in the week or late the week before and told me he had an idea, A or B. A was to throw the belt down, B was to become the NWA champion. And he gave me the good and bad of both sides and didn't tell me which one he wanted. He said, this is the good and bad of throwing it down, this is the good and bad of keeping it, and whatever. So we went to the tournament that night, and all week long my head's going back and forth. And what really was a big concern to me at that time, as he's still a fairly young guy in the business, was guys like Steamboat, the Funks, the Briscoes, even Dusty Rhodes and Flair, who I had differences with, guys that I looked up to and respected greatly, had held that belt. And I didn't want any way for them to think that I was sort of crapping on the leg of their legacy.
Sure.
It was, to me, the NWA was dead and gone. The NWA that I remember and grew up was dead and gone. And so I saw that as a chance for ECW. It was either, let's ride this new train to its maximum, or let's try to get this old train back up and running. And to me, it just seemed like a no-brainer to go with ECW.
Right. Now, you just hit on something there that was going to be my next question. Actually, you mentioned Ric Flair, the differences that you guys have.
Yes.
What is the issue between you and Flair? What's he's went on record many times, as I'm sure you've heard.
Sure. Well, I hear your things. I don't pay much attention to what he says about me because at this point it's sort of irrelevant. There was a time when I challenged him to a shoot in ECW when he was still pretty much hot in the game and hot in the business, and I was at the peak of my game and he never accepted. So to me it's 20 years ago and way past the point of even considering.
Right.
My heart goes out to him as having lost his son. I can't imagine anybody going through. I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy, and my heart legitimately and genuinely goes out to Rick for that. That's one of life's horrible tragedies, and I can only imagine how bad it must feel.
Right.
But my differences with Flair are many that would probably take an hour to talk about them. He, first and foremost, he was the reason I got into the business. I idolized him. I looked up to him. He was the guy. If you had Hulk Hogan and Ric Flair, I didn't want Hulk Hogan. I wanted to watch Flair.
Right.
He was a hero to me, and when I met him, and maybe it was unfair of me to have him on such a pedestal. When I met him, he fell so short as a man. From pulling out private body parts in bars full of kids and running up and down hallways naked, 2 o'clock in the morning in the hotels. I mean, stuff that you did in the frat house when you were 18
Right.
years old, not when you're 45
Right.
years old, born heavyweight champion.
Yep.
And my big concern as a young guy in the business was I didn't want fan A, B, C, D, E, F, G, or all the way to Z. I didn't want any of those fans to look at me and say, well, Shane Douglas is a wrestler and Ric Flair's a wrestler, he does that stuff. Shane, do you pull your
comparisons.
private body parts out in front of kids? And I didn't want anybody to think there was any kind of connection that way.
Sure.
So, and there were a lot of things in the business, that Flair, let's face it, Ric Flair, his spot was solid.
Yes.
Nobody was
Right.
taking. I don't care if you were 10 times the worker. The Nature Boy Ric Flair's spot was solid.
Right.
He was so paranoid of the young guys, Steve Austin and Brian Pillman and Shane Douglas and so many others coming up the ladder, that he used every political ploy he could to try to hold us down. Well, Father Time works against all of us.
Oh,
It's worked against me. It worked against him. It'll work against everybody in the business, no matter how young they are. And I just thought it sad that a guy of that stature and that ability, because Ric Flair was probably the best pure entertainer and wrestler the business has ever seen, that he would be paranoid of some snot-nosed kid from New Brighton, Pennsylvania, or some long-haired kid named Steve Austin from Texas, or
Right.
from some curly-haired kid from Cincinnati. It just seemed strange to me.
Sure. Right on. Now, of course, everybody knows you. I mean, you've been almost everywhere. XPW, ECW, UWF, NWA, everywhere in between.
Sometimes more than one.
Sure. Who is there one person, or who would you say is your all-time favorite opponent?
Oh, that's hard because there's many that come to mind. You know, obviously Taz, Bam Bam Bigelow was, even though it was a very short-lived angle between us, there was such a bond between us as friends that, and I was just so damned impressed with his abilities. I mean, 400 pounds, he's drop kicking and cartwheeling and moonsaulting. It was just stunning to watch. So I have fond memories of that. I have fond memories of working with Funk. You know, I learned a ton from Funk. I loved working with Sabu. Tommy Dreamer was always a great opponent, and Raven was somebody that I always gelled well with. And so each of those guys and each of those angles, I have fond memories of each of those angles for different reasons. I think with Tommy Dreamer, Shane Douglas started proving he could be a main eventer. With Sabu, he proved that he could work with a very different style and pull this guy up to his level. With Taz, it was these two mainstream powerhouses, Immovable Object versus Irresistible Force. Which one's going to win out? And both stood their ground. And with Bam Bam Bigelow, that these guys could take the company to a different level and pay-per-view to a different level. Right. So for me, all those guys hold very special places in my heart.
Sure. And wrapping up, our last question here. From the start of your career up until this point, what changes have you seen that you would like to make? You know what I'm talking about. Sure.
Yes.
You know, today's product.
Today's part of the kids, I'll say this up front so it doesn't sound like I'm just slamming today's kids. They're amazingly athletic. They're more athletic than my generation. My generation was more athletic than, say, Bruno's generation. These kids today are amazing at what they can do, but what breaks my heart in watching them is they don't have a Bill Watts hoarding over them in the dressing room, intimidating them and saying, why'd you do it that way, rah, 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 and screaming you're like the coach did back in football, you know?
Sure.
They didn't have that. They don't have, back then, you know, Bill Watts and Eddie Gilbert and Terry Taylor was helping out, writing phenomenal storylines. In ECW, Paul Heyman wrote outstanding storylines. People today say, well, ECW, the ones that never saw it, will say, oh, it was just all garbage cans and chairs and tables. And you go back and watch that, there were tremendous storylines, and the tables and the chairs and all that was icing on the cake. There was a great match that was the substrate of any of those storylines. The whole point of the business today, I think, has moved so far away. To me, there's many points. First of all, you go back and watch Bruno versus whoever. It looked like a competition. There's a reason his ears looked like cauliflower. There's a reason their noses were all busted and their fingers were all, their arms don't unbend, because they were out there snugly wrestling, and it looked believable and real, and it looked like a competition.
Sure.
My generation, I think, did the same thing fairly well. This generation of kids, it looks like more like a dance or an acrobatics routine than it looks like a competition.
Right.
I would love to see what these kids with their athletic prowess would do with a Bill Watts, with a Terry Funk, with a Paul Heyman writing for them, with a Dusty Rhodes teaching them, whoever. Because those are the people that we came up in the business. The business back then was predicated as a kid in the dressing room. If you got your foot in the dressing room because you were a good-looking kid, had a good body, had a little bit of ability, they would test you out. Like when I first got to UWF, they put me with Pez Watley. And I'm sure they had Pez test me every night. Sure. Every night, push the kid, try to slip him up. And I'm sure I made mistakes, and they'd come back and they would tell you, you screwed up here, you screwed up here. And if you didn't show that you could make those changes, you didn't get to step 2. And if you didn't pick those things up, you didn't get to step 3. So back then, by the time you got to the World Heavyweight Championship or the main event or the World Tag Team Championship, you had been in the business for 7, 8, 10 years. And you had been through all these angles with these great, fantastic talents. And today, you see a lot of these kids coming right out of the school in Florida, whatever, and shoved right to the top.
That's right.
Look, I've worked with Steamboat, I've worked with Arn Anderson, I've worked with Dean Malenko, I've worked with Fit Finley.
Definitely.
I know what those guys are all capable of, and it's fantastic. And I know that's not the stuff that they're teaching. So I can't figure out where it's going from them agenting their matches to the writing to the performance where it's falling to the wayside. I would love to see these kids with what they can do athletically in the system that I came up
With the
with.
time given, right?
Sure.
Well, Shane, I appreciate your time. I know you have a busy night ahead of you. You got a big match
Big
coming
match,
up.
sure.
But I want to thank you for being on the show.
Appreciate it, brother. Thank
And
you.
guys, this is it. Just franchise himself, Shane Douglas.